the benefits of innovation might not be as crystal clear as you might have thought. That's our topic today, the delusion of innovation. Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Let's go.
Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We are here each week to help you lead more confidently and make a bigger difference, both professionally and personally. This episode is sponsored by 13 Days to Remarkable Leadership, a free leadership video series based on Kevin's book, Remarkable Leadership. Sign up by going to remarkablepodcast.com/13 days. And now, here's your host, Kevin.
You probably would agree with me that innovation is sexy and innovation is hip. And well, maybe that's part of the problem, as our guests today are going to talk about. Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, and welcome to our guests. I think it's only the third or fourth time that I've had guests, not guest, and they are Lee Vinsel and Andy Russell. And let me tell you about them, and then we'll dive in. So Lee Vinsel is a professor of science, technology, and society at Virginia Tech. Andy Russell is a professor of history and the dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at SUNY Polytechnic Institute. Together, they are the founders of the Maintainers Research Network and Conferences. Their work and writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The Wired. Today, they're on the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. They've recently released a book that we're going to talk about some today. It's a great book. It's titled The Innovation Delusion: How Our Obsession with the New Has Disrupted the Work That Matters Most. Guys, welcome. I'm glad to have you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Kevin.
Okay, so I will tell you that the last time I had co-guests with me, they met and eventually they got married. So be forewarned, just saying. But so I am curious though. I mean, we'll get to the work itself, but how did this work come about, and how did you guys get connected? One of you want to give us a little bit about the journey that got us to where we are today?
Yeah, so I'll take this one. Andy and I met in grad school. I considered going to Hopkins, where he was a grad student, and we met that way. And then we stayed in touch, and I ended up getting hired to work with him at Stevens Institute of Technology, where we started this project. And, you know, I think that the Maintainers organization, a group that we help run that tries to draw attention to maintenance and repair, and this book really started out of a kind of frustration with buzzwords and hype, which you find, you know, so much throughout higher education. The word innovation is just everywhere, and we grew kind of tired of it. And then, you know, the kind of founding moment was Walter Isaacson's book, The Innovators: How a Group of Hackers, Geniuses, and Geeks Created the Digital Revolution came out. And Andy had various problems with the book, but mostly it was just, again, the focus on innovation and sexy new things. And he said, well, we should create a counter volume, which we should call The Maintainers: How Bureaucrats, Standard Engineers, and Introverts Create Technologies That Kind of Work Most of the Time.
And that's not the title of the book, everybody.
I know. We thought that that title, you know, kind of depended too much on the knowledge of Isaacson's book and the whole background. We thought it didn't work.
It was sort of a personal meme, it sounds like.
Yeah. And then we started playing with that idea online. I wrote a blog post about it and started playing with it on Twitter. And it just kind of took off. You know, all of a sudden people were pushing us to hold a conference. We wrote an essay for Eon called Hail the Maintainers. And the idea just kind of took on a life of its own. And eventually it led to an agent approaching us and asking us if we wanted to write a book about the idea. So that's the kind of backstory.
You all heard it here first before the movie comes out. Now you know the backstory. So Andy, tell us about your concern about innovation and why, since the book is called The Innovation Delusion. So like, what is the big, I mean, Lee's teed it up. What's your concern about innovation, and talk about that a little bit?
The big concern is that people put too much weight and too much faith in innovation to cure all of society's problems. And when we've reflected on how much people talk about innovation. And the term we use in the book is innovation speak. And it's all the buzzwords, blitz scaling and design thinking and, all these things that we hear in management circles. When people put too much weight and emphasis on those things, that space in their calendars and in cognitive space that they're not spending on details of things that already exist, keeping things going, maintaining things, maintenance, upkeep, repair for things that were once new and are now broken. So our argument's really fundamentally about a society out of balance, that we privilege the new and privilege the innovators too much, and we don't pay enough respect and compensation and cognitive mental energy towards the things that actually matter more than the shiny new objects.
So newsflash, these guys are not Luddites. You guys don't dislike innovation. What you're saying is we need to rethink the balance. Is that a fair way to say that?
Yeah, absolutely. We're not Luddites. We like our gadgets. We like our apps.
And apparently Andy likes to color code his books. Just so you're watching all. Those of you on the podcast that are listening don't know this, but for the large percentage, Andy's bookcase, all three of us have bookcases all around us. Andy's bookcase behind him has all of the blue books in shades together in black, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like cars. We know we have a lot of white cars because we have a lot of white book spines, apparently.
Yep. Yeah, that's a dominant color. Yeah, we like new things, and even walking through an example like an iPhone, which Lee and I have. You buy it new, but it takes maintenance. It takes upkeep. You got to make sure the screen protector's up to date. You got to make sure the case isn't broke. You got to figure out how to back up all your pictures. And then how to back up the backups. So, and just buying new phones every month isn't going to solve those problems. So that's, it's all about the balance. And it's really, to go back to something Lee said, it's this community of scholars that we came from who study technology from deep historical and social scientific perspectives. And we know from all of their work that the moments of innovation or invention are just the beginning of this long trajectory. If we think of technology as having lives, there's a great book by Jonathan Coopersmith about the fax machine, right? That's had this 150-year life. And
there are some people, by the way, that are listening that don't know. I've never seen a fax machine. You just have to Google it. But anyway,
they're still there. Or ask a doctor's office about it. Yeah, they're still there. So, it's really about taking those ideas from that community and pushing them into contemporary context and asking anyone who reads a book, even if they're not a historian, to think about the balance in their lives and the balance about new stuff and old stuff in their lives.
So one of the reasons that I picked these guys, I know these guys, but I know these guys from the book. And so backstory for everybody, the reason I picked it was the book was a different kind of take than what we often have on the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. And in talking to the two of you before we started, you were excited about being able to talk to this audience about this work. But before we get into, leadership stuff and all that, and I want to get there, I want to spend a little more time on that. So talk a little bit more. One of the things I always say is that as leaders, we often have a different perspective than our teams. It's important. And yet sharing that perspective is helpful with them. And yet even us as leaders by no means have the perfect perspective. So I'd love for you, Andy or Lee, either one, to share a little bit more about that perspective of the life of a technology. Because I think that and what I want everyone who's listening and watching to think about is, as you think about that, whichever one you guys pick, doesn't matter. Think about, where are the things in our business in that lifespan, and how does that impact the decisions we ought to be making about it? So with that overly long tee up, why don't one of you take that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it might help to give an example and be specific about it. So, if some of your listeners run factories or manufacturing plants or utilities, right? They've got capital that they've invested in, and their business is based on uptime, right? And having things run smoothly. Now they may, to bring in innovation for a second, they may always be looking for ways to improve and change that process, new things to introduce. But the real thing is efficiency and uptime, and that requires constant upkeep and maintenance. For that reason, they need to think as creatively about that way of sustaining things as bringing in new things. And of course, new things, sometimes if you get over infatuated with new things, you can introduce them just because you're infatuated with that new thing without thinking about how it's going to upend your existing process. You end up with more downtime. So I think that's
a month, right?
Yeah.
A month, right?
Yeah. I have this, I have a friend who works in IT at a university, and, some of the IT systems in the university he works in are still running on COBOL. The language code, I think, was created in 1968 or something like that. Meanwhile, like the administrators who run his unit were going to like higher education conferences and coming back. They don't have any technical knowledge, by the way. They're managers without that technical knowledge. They were coming back from higher ed conferences saying that the university should get IBM Watson, like the AI system, and it was like, how is that supposed to help us down here in the trenches working with the, just keeping this stuff going? So I think that's the kind of balance we're talking about.
And oh, by the way, the Cobalt systems are still working.
Yeah, well, yeah. I'm not saying Cobalt's bad.
No, I know you're not. Yeah. And I was actually trying to amplify. I mean, I know I'm not at all. Trying to amplify that point.
Yeah.
Not take it the other way. One of the things that I thought about, with a leader business hat on as I read the book, was these two words. And so I'd love for you guys to just say, okay, Kevin, you missed the point, or, play off of these two words. Like, organizations, we're often thinking about the project, that's the new thing, and the process, that's the existing thing, right? So it's sort of like project versus process. It's kind of like, Lee, to your point, the new technology versus keeping the one we've got running. So talk about the tension there, because we already know that we're sucked towards the new in many ways, but talk about the tension there and how, you framed the question, Andy, as a balance. What's your advice about how we get better balance?
I'll give you an example from my day job as a dean here of a relatively small school. While we were writing the book, we talked about how much of that to put into it or not. And I don't know how much is in there, but let me just tell you about it. The imperative for my university in particular is to increase enrollment, is to grow. And we have some some cautionary tales about growth in the book. We have a section called the Growth Delusion, right? Mm-hmm. That matches the Innovation Delusion. For financial reasons, that's really important to the people I report to my supervisors. So when I talk to the faculty in my college, which include people who teach writing, physics, math, biology, the bread and butter, general education, they kind of look at me and raise an eyebrow and say, well, the students need to learn calculus, or the students need to learn physics. And so I appreciate what you're saying, but for every dollar, for every hour you, Dean, spend on doing that, then you're not paying attention to the foundations that we need for our students. And so I'm kind of caught in the middle, right? I mean, I think most of us are middle managers one way or another. We all have bosses.
Well, I own the company, but I have a wife, so I have a boss too. Let's just be clear.
Yep.
Well, and even if you're a CEO, you've got a board. Like, you're right. We are all, I like alliteration. We're all managers in the middle, all of us. And so we're always going to have a whole bunch of different priorities to juggle and tensions to deal with. Yeah. And this is just another one of them, right? Go ahead, Andy.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think the important thing is to listen. You're going to have to listen to your boss, but if you're a leader and you're not listening to the priorities of the people whose success you depend on, when I interview people, I always tell them my success depends on your success. So I have every interest in making sure you're successful. And it's that kind of approach that if their values are, well, I've been working on this project or this course for 10 years, and I don't want to walk away from it. I've got too much invested in it. Then that priority becomes my priority. And how I balance that against a competing priority, that's a negotiation. But the most important thing is to not let the priorities of the new thing just totally swamp and wash out the projects that people have been working on for a long time, and the processes, to your point, that they've put in place to make sure that they're healthy and meeting their purpose.
You know, I want to take that back because now you're talking about priorities, which I think is a really important part of this conversation. But I want to take everyone back to something you said. I think it was you, Andy, earlier about the idea of making sure we have some cognitive space, I believe is the words you used, to make sure we're at least thinking about. See, that was academic speak, by the way. Make sure you all are thinking about the maintenance and not just the new, right? If we're always chasing the new squirrel, then we don't have any time, you know. So I mean, finding that cognitive space to make sure that we're balancing not just the work but the thinking. Is that a fair way to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's part of where we're trying to go with the leadership conversation in this book, is just having maintenance on the table as part of the thinking, right? What you're working through. So even the new thing, even the project where you're building the new thing, that has to be maintained, right? So are you thinking about that up front? I mean, there's so many examples we can give of people, buying new systems without thinking about the long-term costs of maintenance. And when you look at the long-term costs of maintenance, you would never buy that system in the first place, right? So making that part of the conversation from day one, okay, we're not just doing this to do this now. We need to think about 2 years down the line with this thing, or 5 years, however long, you want to put your horizon.
No disrespect to either of you in higher education, and it certainly isn't only in higher education, but just because we got the money to build the building,
yeah,
not the
There's
whole.
a lot of nasty buildings on my campus I can tell you about. So,
well, we're not here to trash SUNY Polytechnic or Tech or anybody else. It's just another example, right?
Yeah, I know, totally.
So one thing about this, Kevin, that we wrote into the book is that it's easy, it's intuitive, but you need to help people understand how intuitive it is. And so the chapters in our book, in parts 2 and part 3, look at these issues on different scales. The societal level scale, the big scale, where we talk about infrastructure, a national level, international level things. Then the business or organizational scale, which is the meso level, and then the individual level. And sometimes the easiest entry point is the individual level when you ask people about their diet or their exercise regimen or how they keep up their vehicles or their home.
Hey, don't get so personal.
Well, you look great, so obviously you got the message.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I'll just say, listen, we are talking, if you're just joining us, we're talking with Lee Vinsel and Andy Russell about their new book, The Innovation Delusion, how our obsession with the new has disrupted the work that matters most, and their work with the idea of maintainers and being maintainers. And so you mentioned that at the top, Lee, about this business, but just talk about the idea of the maintainers. Either one of you.
Yeah, I mean, I find it helpful sometimes to make an analogy to Susan Cain's book, Quiet, which is about the role of introverts in our society and in our businesses. So introverts are, folks that don't grab the limelight and yet are absolutely crucial to the health and success of our organizations. And I think the maintainers are the same people. They're the same thing. Sometimes they're introverts, sometimes they're not, but they're the same kind of situation where maintainers are the people who keep our processes, our systems going. And we know from lots of different kinds of evidence that the maintainers in our organizations often get less attention than the innovators, the people who are doing the new flashy thing. And that comes with sometimes less compensation, but definitely less recognition for what they're doing, which we think creates problems.
We could all make a list of the rock star innovators. Harder to make the list of the rock star maintainers, I suppose, right? So let's get sort of granular for a couple of minutes about this and leadership, and then I want to come back up before we finish. But I want to go down into leadership for just one more second. So either of you, what do we, all of us that are watching and listening, that are leaders, what do we need to know about how to support maintenance in our organizations as you've now described it, Lee, and what gets in our way of doing that?
I can take this one. So one of the chapters in our book is called The Maintenance Mindset. And I think this is really a good place for people to enter, to answer those questions. And we've distilled it down to 3 points. The first is a simple recognition that maintenance sustains success. And it doesn't matter what your definition of success is. It's a point that Lee made earlier. To keep things going, you need to maintain them. And there's all kinds of data. There's a whole industry of consultants who and professionals who work in maintenance and reliability and can demonstrate to you the return on investment in maintenance, no matter what kind of facility that you have. Okay, so step one, maintenance sustains success. Step two, maintenance depends on culture and management. So if the leader is always rewarding the person who's come up with a crazy new idea, over time, the people who just keep things going get the message. They're not important. Okay, so, and we've seen, in the book, we go through different examples of this, whether it's in the US Air Force or in the private sector. The third point is that maintenance requires constant care. So it's something that takes a habit of mind to keep revisiting what are your maintenance routines, and it even takes some creativity and even helps to be innovative. So new technologies can help with maintenance. And in the book, we talk about companies that are using predictive analytics, artificial intelligence, remote sensors, all these things that if they're just buzzwords by themselves, they strike us as a little bit shallow. But in the service of a goal for an organization, that constant care and those creative approaches are really important. So that's the maintenance mindset. I think once readers wrap their heads around those 3 things, they'll see very easily how that fits into their organizations and into their lives.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. So thanks for that, Andy. I want to go back to the higher level perspective because there was something else in the book that I found interesting and got me thinking differently, which is one of the things that one of the reasons I wanted to have you guys on, because you're kind of not in the mainstream of what we might normally have as guests. And so I love this conversation. There's a section in the book where we're talking about maintenance, but there's this other word that might be flowing through people's heads, and that word is infrastructure. And you guys say that be careful, they're not necessarily the same thing. Can we just talk about that? Because I'm still thinking about that. I think you're exactly right, and I'd love to have you share a little bit more about that.
You want to go for that one, Andy?
Sure. Yeah. So, yeah, you're right. They are slightly different things. Infrastructure does require maintenance, but maintenance doesn't just mean building infrastructure. And one of the people that we spent a lot of time interviewing, a guy named Chuck Marone, who's a leader of Strong Towns, has made this point really forcefully. And it's a point that came up earlier, that building out more infrastructure also means that you're building obligations and putting them on the shoulders of future generations. And we've seen this, Lee mentioned it earlier, you can see this in the US highway system, literally inscribed in concrete all over our country. But you can see it in buildings, in these giant houses that people build, subdivisions, building out infrastructure without a plan for how you're going to support it sustainably is a recipe for disaster. So that's one key distinction. There's probably others that Lee could.
Well, I think that alone is worth giving some people something to think about. So you're, as a leader in an organization, it's our responsibility to think about that, right? So we don't end up with the system that sounded great and then, oh my gosh, there's no way we would ever know how to maintain it. But just even in the small, I think the other thing I think it's worth us all thinking about is this doesn't just have to be, with the highway system that Eisenhower helped us get in 1955, right? It's also about the small decisions, relatively small decisions on the projects that you're making on your teams. And okay, this is a good idea, but will we be able to keep this working, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are we going to be able to, is it going to be sustainable? I love that word that you guys have used. Before we start to wrap up, I as an author, I know how this goes. You finish a book and then you wait for it to come out. And as we're talking, the book is not out yet, but by the time anyone sees it or hears this, it will be out. But I read it in April, right? Or read parts of it in April, read more of it more recently. But here's the question. Since then, this thing called COVID has happened, and there's been a pandemic. And while, some people will be reading this and perhaps that will be somewhat in our past, the reality is it's changed our world in some ways. And my question is, what are you all both thinking about now, and how are your ideas about maintenance and innovation and all of these things influenced, or what's different now because of COVID?
Yeah, I think we didn't plan on a pandemic happening. That's true. We just had a review coming out soon that calls us strangely prophetic when it comes to like essential workers and things like this. I think there's a whole class of people that the pandemic has drawn attention to, who are the people we call maintainers. So I think the pandemic kind of, put on different goggles on us and kind of has given us an opportunity to think about these people and what we owe them, when it comes in terms of compensation, quality of life. So that's like the big theme, I think, is just like, what do we owe the essential workers? What do we owe these maintainers? How can we better things for them? The other thing is that, not to get too political or policy based, but I think that, we're going to have to do more government policy to dig ourselves out of the economic kind of trough we've ended up in. And I think, given kind of how bad U.S. infrastructure is, it gets like a D+ from the American Society of Civil Engineers, kind of maintaining, doing a big infrastructure maintenance push over the next couple years as a way to spur the economy, I think is a really good, would be a good way of dealing with this pandemic. And we get the benefit of better infrastructure too. Andy, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with all that, obviously, particularly the importance of essential workers and maintainers who I'm really happy to see getting more recognition. I wish we would pay them more as well. The other thing that we talk about in the book is the right to repair movement. And we've seen this idea, which is that owners of technologies should have the ability to get into the manual and fix those things. And this has come up with ventilators, and it's been a big topic of discussion amongst some of the activists who were prominent in right to repair, that the manuals for ventilators have been hard to find. And so the med techs who operate and fix these things need access to that information in order to maintain and repair and improve these things. So that's, if there was a COVID chapter, they'd be in it.
There you go. Well, there's not a COVID chapter, but you just wrote part of it right here on the podcast. So a couple of quick questions for both of you. So we're going to do this in quick order. Number one, Lee, what do you do for fun?
I play Dungeons and Dragons with my children and play guitar. Yeah.
Andy, what do you do for fun?
Bass fishing, and I watch soccer.
Those are very different things for the two guys that wrote the book together. Okay, the only question I told him I was going to ask, Andy, what are you reading these days?
I'm reading a few books. I'm reading this great book by Verlin Klinkenberg called Short Sentences About Writing, which is part poetry, part writing. And I'm reading a book, an old book by Lou Galambos, who was one of my advisors in grad school, called Networks of Innovation. And it's about vaccine development at Merck.
All right. Same question, Lee. What are you reading?
I'm rereading parts of Adam Tooze's book, Crashed, How a Decade of Financial Crises Changed the World. He wrote it about the 2008 financial crisis, but I'm about to interview him about how those insights can be applied to the pandemic and where we're at with the economy now.
All right. Awesome. And the question you really want me to ask, where can people learn more about this book, get in touch with you, etc.? Tell us that.
The easiest way to get all of our information is on themaintainers.org. It's important to have the in front, but that's the easiest way to go for everything.
Themaintainers.org. And the book is called The Innovation Delusion. You can find that any place. Fine book. There we go. The fine books are sold. So now the question I have for all of you who are watching and listening is now what? Hopefully this episode, maybe more than some others, has given you something new to think about, but thinking alone isn't enough. Cognitive space, important, not enough. What action are you going to take as a result of this? What do you need to do to maybe reprioritize or rebalance some of the projects, some of the innovations in your organization or on your team with what you need to do to be maintaining the things that you're doing? What did you take from this episode that you will take action on? That's my challenge to all of you. Guys, thanks for being here. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks. It's fun.
All right. So before we go, everybody, I'd love to have you join the conversation. Let me just tell you what's coming. By the time you hear this one, you'll know that most all of our future podcast episodes are going to be live. And the best way to get a hold of them live before they get out on your podcast app is to join in our Facebook group or our LinkedIn group. Pick your favorite networking site and join us there. You can go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook. remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn, and give us a recommendation if you would, but join us there for all the latest stuff as well as future live episodes. Hope you'll do that. And I hope you'll be back for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Thanks, everybody.